This is my 2004 Mazda 6 Wagon with the 3.0 Duratec V6. I bought this car a couple years ago with over 200,000 miles on it, and it had been run too long between oil changes, and it had fouled the pre-cats, and they disintegrated and got sucked into the engine through the EGR, and the engine is shot. The car runs and drives, but it'll only do about 35-40 miles an hour before the engine just starts losing power and making a lot of racket. I bought a 2008 Ford Fusion Duratec. It's the same block and heads as the Mazda Duratec, different valve covers, different timing cover. So I'm going to do an engine swap, and I'll retain the valve covers and timing cover off of the Mazda Duratec. At this point, it's a relatively common swap, and I'm just going to document the basic steps along the way for anybody who might be contemplating this swap. So I'm going to start by removing the hood. You don't have to remove the hood. You can just bungee it up, but my ceiling in here is 14 feet, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it and set it on a blanket on the roof of the car. I'm going to remove the front bumper cover and the headlights, and then I'm going to jack up the car and I'm going to drain the coolant and the engine oil and the transmission fluid. Then I'll do another update with the next steps. Okay, I removed the hood and set it on the roof of the car on a blanket. I removed the front bumper cover. I went ahead and removed the battery. It's a good idea when you're going to be unplugging things to disconnect the battery first, because if you accidentally unplug your impact sensors on some cars, it'll set off your airbags. It costs a lot of money to replace the airbags if you accidentally set them off. I jacked up the car and drained the engine coolant into a clean pan, the engine oil into a pan, and then I drained the transmission fluid. I removed the headlights. I jacked it up before I drained the fluids. I'm going to pull the transmission and the engine together. So the output shafts will have to be removed, and the rotors have to come off. So I hit those spots with WD-40, and while I was under there, I hit the hardware on the exhaust components. And next, I'm going to disconnect the transmission cooler and disconnect the radiator hoses at the Y pipe by the water pump, and I'm going to disconnect the refrigerant line for the air conditioner condenser, which sits up here in front of your radiator. And then I'm going to unbolt the bumper support and cross member support, and that will all be removed as one unit. There's a few things that have to be disconnected also before that can be done. The power steering reservoir has to be disconnected. It stays with the engine for now. Then the cable that runs underneath your dash to activate the hood latch has to be disconnected, and a couple other small things like that. But the main goal is to get this whole front radiator support assembly removed, and then get the airbox, battery tray, and coolant reservoir removed, and then we'll do another update. So I removed the airbox assembly and the battery tray, and I removed the coolant reservoir. I disconnected the lines for the refrigerant to the air conditioner condenser, and I cleaned those and wrapped them with masking tape to prevent any dirt or debris getting in there. In a few instances where I thought there might be some confusion on reassembly with where the wiring harness goes, I labeled those by wrapping masking tape and then writing on them where they went. So I got the whole front radiator support removed as a unit. That's it, sitting right there. The coolant reservoir stays attached to the core support. Next, I'm going to remove the CV shafts on both sides. Then I'm going to disconnect the exhaust. Then I'm going to remove the 3 torque converter nuts. There's a rubber access plate on the bottom of the transmission that you remove, and that will give you access to the 3 torque converter nuts. You have to rotate the torque converter and the engine, the crank, through a complete cycle to access all 3 nuts, and that's most easily done while the engine is still in the car, so that you can use an 18mm socket on the crankshaft nut on the right side of the engine to roll the engine through while sighting through the access port on the bottom of the transmission to locate the 3 torque converter nuts as they come into view. Remove those one at a time. That process is much easier done while the engine is still in the car. That's the process for this next phase. Remove the CV shafts, unbolt the exhaust, and take the 3 nuts off of the torque converter. Then I'll do another update. Alright, I have the CV shafts removed. I made a separate step-by-step video of that process. I'll upload that video to this channel if you need to see that process in a step-by-step way. After removing the CV shafts, I disconnected the exhaust manifolds from the main exhaust that runs out the back of the car. I removed the 3 nuts that are connecting the torque converter to the flywheel, to the flex plate. To do that, the best way I found is to lay a mirror on the floor and then remove the little rubber access cover that's on the underside of the transmission bell housing. When you remove that rubber cover, you can see the back of the flex plate with a light under there and a mirror on the floor and an 18mm socket on the harmonic balancer. You can rotate the engine through clockwise and you'll see those nuts come into view one at a time. There's 3 of them, 120 degrees apart. So rotate the crank as you see one of the nuts come into view, then stop rotating, go under there and remove that nut. The 3 nuts are each 15mm. I removed the 3 torque converter nuts, I separated the exhaust, I removed the CV shafts, and while I was under the car, underneath on the back side of the transmission is this mount, and it mounts just like this. The small end mounts to the transmission, the big end bolts to the lower end of your firewall, and it stops the engine from rocking under torque when you're accelerating. So you can't pull the engine with it attached. So I went ahead and removed that. It's 3 bolts on the transmission side and 1 bolt through a bracket. Take the 3 bolts out up front, and then you take the rear bolt out, and then you tip it down and push it up, and it slides out of the bracket on the firewall. I'm going to start going through and disconnecting coolant lines and electrical connections and vacuum lines. It's just kind of a slow, methodical process, probably with quite a bit of masking tape labels so I can remember where everything goes back. I believe I'm going to end up removing the throttle body before I pull the engine. I'm going to leave the entire transmission mount attached to the transmission. Then I won't have to worry about realigning the transmission mount once I put the engine back in. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. Then I'll do another update after I've got most of my connections up top ready to pull the engine. Alright, I got everything disconnected up top on the engine. It was mostly electrical connections. I labeled the ones I thought I might be confused about when I'm plugging everything back in after the swap is finished. I disconnected the pressurized line coming from the top of the power steering pump and pulled it out of the way. I disconnected the suction line from the bottom of the AC compressor. I taped it to keep dirt out, and I pulled it back underneath the fender out of the way. Disconnected the fuel line. You'll need a special little tool to do that. There's videos on YouTube about how to disconnect the fuel line. There was a couple more coolant lines I had to disconnect. I removed the throttle body. So now I'm going to move my jack stands back farther to make room for my lift to come back under the car, and then I'm going to hook up a chain. I'm going to wrap a chain around the middle of the arm on the engine mount side, and then on the forward edge of my transmission mount, so that I've just got a chain looped across the top. And then I'm going to pull up an inch or 2 and go into the car and make sure I'm free of my exhaust, and then I'm just going to start slowly working the engine up and forward out of the car, and I will do another update after I've got it pulled free. Alright, I got the engine pulled out of the engine bay. The only place where I got hung up and almost made a mistake was my rear oxygen sensor. I had it unplugged, but it had a little plastic clip attaching it to the wiring harness. So I had the engine already raised up about 2 inches and partially pulled forward when I saw that the O2 sensor was still attached. But otherwise, it was just a matter of slowly raise the engine up a little, coming forward a little, then checking all the way around. And raise it up a little, come forward a little, and check it all the way around. I did have to go under at one point with a little pry bar and pry my rear catalytic converter and header assembly up out of the flange for the exhaust that goes out the back of the car. After I got that separated and unclipped the oxygen sensor, then I just came up and out with the engine, and then once I got it free of the car, I lowered it down here so that if something happens and it falls, it's only got a few inches to go instead of a few feet to go. I don't want to crush my oil pan because I have to reuse it. So now I can set the engine down and disconnect it from the chain hoist. I'm going to roll over the donor engine, and I'm going to start swapping everything onto the Ford Fusion engine that's going to go in the car. The valve covers and the timing cover and the oil pan off of this engine all have to go into the Fusion engine, as well as all the accessories. The alternator and the air conditioner compressor and the power steering pump and the transmission. So once I get this set on a stand, stabilized and disconnected from the hoist, then I'll begin the process of swapping everything over, and I'll do some updates during that process. I decided to go ahead and set the engine assembly on the floor to separate the transmission. It would be more difficult to do on an elevated surface, and then I'd risk dropping the transmission. So I removed the engine wiring harness, and I removed the transmission wiring harness. I removed the intake assembly, the serpentine belt, the alternator, the power steering pump assembly, both manifolds. Once I had the transmission separated, the transmission is held on by 8 bolts. The bell housing is bolted to the engine block with 8 bolts. Before I removed those, I removed the starter, and then that gives you access through the top of the transmission to use a little pry bar to hold the torque converter back while you rock the transmission and separate it from the engine, because you don't want the torque converter to slide out of the transmission at any point. So with the starter removed, I used a pry bar to hold the torque converter back, rocked the transmission free. This is the transmission. I went ahead and then removed the flywheel and the aluminum plate that acts as a spacer between the bell housing and the block, and that's where I'm at so far. Next, I'm going to see if I can get the valve covers off and maybe a few other things, and then I'll do another update. This is the engine that came out of the Mazda. I removed the air conditioner compressor, and then I removed the oil pan and the timing cover. Then I pulled over the Fusion engine and went through the same process on it. Removed the accessories that were still attached to it, then removed the valve covers, the oil pan, and the timing cover. The valve covers, timing cover, and oil pan on the 2 engines are substantially different. You can't run the Fusion valve covers, timing cover, or oil pan if you're going to put the engine in the Mazda 6. The fuel rail assembly is also different in the way that it connects to the Mazda fuel line, at least in the configuration that I have, which is a 2004 Mazda 6 and a 2008 Ford Fusion engine. On the Fusion, you've got a male stub on your fuel rail, and on the Mazda engine, you've got a female stub on the fuel rail, as well as a vacuum control valve. So I removed this assembly from the Fusion engine, and I went ahead and already removed the fuel rail assembly from the Mazda engine, and I've cleaned it and installed it on the Fusion engine. Another component you have to swap. This is the oil pickup tube that bolts underneath inside the oil pan. This is off of the Fusion engine. I won't be using it. I've already installed the oil pickup tube that I removed from the Mazda engine. You want to thoroughly clean that, especially if you've had complete engine failure on your prior engine. Get a new one if you can, because if you get metal particulates settled into some sludge in the bottom of this, it's really difficult to get that out of there, and you don't want to suck particulates into your new engine. The next step will be to clean and install the timing cover, and then oil pan, and then valve covers that I removed from the Mazda engine. and install them onto the Fusion engine. The valve covers and the oil pan all have baffles that will need to be removed before they can be thoroughly cleaned. The baffles tend to trap oil sludge and possible contaminants, so remove the baffles and then clean those with a pressure washer. You can take them to car wash, hit them with some engine degreaser or purple cleaner, and the timing cover has to go on first and come off last, because at the top of the timing cover you've got a flange on each side that your valve covers bolt to, and on the bottom you've got a flange that your oil pan bolts to. So the timing cover can't be removed until you've removed the oil pan and the valve covers. So I'm going to go ahead and get started to get that stuff cleaned, new gaskets, and installed, and then I'll do another update. Alright, I got the valve covers and oil pan and timing cover cleaned and installed with new gaskets. While I was at it, I went ahead and bolted on the accessories and the serpentine belt. One tricky area that I'd never had a problem with before, when I was installing the harmonic balancer, the seal inside the timing cover kept trying to roll over. The seal surface on the harmonic balancer was clean and smooth, and I had oiled it, so I'm not sure what was happening there, but I solved it by slowly, I used the flex plate to rotate the engine through in steps as I was tightening down the harmonic balancer, and that allowed me to get it set without rolling the seal lip under. So that's something to watch after you've installed your harmonic balancer, or while you're installing it into the new seal on the timing cover. Check it with a flashlight and make sure the seal lip isn't rolling under, because that would cause an oil leak down the road. So the next step, I also replaced the spark plugs, and I replaced the coil packs. You can get a new set of coil packs for these now, aftermarket, for about $40. The original Mazda coil packs were known to have issues, so it's good at this point to go ahead and replace those. It's a bigger project once the intake manifold is installed, so go ahead and do it now if you can. I'm going to use the engine hoist to support the engine so I can disconnect it from the stand. Then I'm going to set it on the floor so that I can connect the transmission. To connect the transmission, you have to line up the 3 studs on the torque converter into the flex plate and get those properly aligned before you can bolt the bell housing to the block. While I have it on the floor, I'll probably also connect the engine wiring harness, and then I'll do another update. Okay, I supported the engine with the engine hoist and unbolted it from the engine stand and lowered it to the floor. Then I brought over the transmission. I used a short pry bar to hold back the torque converter while I maneuvered the transmission up close to the bell housing. With the starter off, you can view through the starter hole at the top of the bell housing, and if you'll rotate one of the torque converter studs to where it's viewable in that opening, that's where I used the pry bar to hold the torque converter back, and then rotated the flex plate so that I had a receiving hole for the torque converter stud lined up in the same orientation as the stud on the torque converter. And then I maneuvered them together, slowly and carefully guiding the torque converter stud into the flex plate. Once the bell housing is against the block, you should be able to rock the torque converter, rotate it back and forth just slightly, and you can actually hear the 3 torque converter studs make contact with the flex plate. It'll go ting, ting, ting. You need that to be free, to have that little bit of play, to know that it's not bound against the flex plate, and to know that all 3 of the studs have properly seated. At that point, you can begin installing the bolts that secure the bell housing to the block. So that process went smoothly for me, and then I installed the engine wiring harness and the transmission wiring harness and coolant pipe for the heater. There's a metal coolant pipe that bolts to the transmission housing that connects to your heater line. A couple things I forgot to mention earlier. The fusion block and heads are very similar, but there are some differences. On the back of the fusion block, between the two alternator mounts, there's an extra aluminum tab cast into the fusion block. Not only do we not need it for the Mazda configuration, but it actually gets in the way of a wiring harness bracket that runs down to the crank position sensor. So you have to use a cutoff wheel or a hacksaw or something to cut about a ½ an inch off of this extra tab that's on the fusion block. It'll become self-apparent as you install the engine wiring harness how much you need to cut off. The engine wiring harness does need to be installed before the alternator, so I actually had to unbolt the alternator to get the wiring harness in. I had already cut off the tab. And then one other difference I noticed in the fusion block and heads is on the fusion front head on the driver's side where your water pump is located. The Mazda heads have an extra hole drilled for a tensioner for the water pump drive belt. The Fusion doesn't have that. The water pump is driven directly from the cam, from a cam pulley without a tensioner. And so if you wanted to run the Mazda tensioner on the Fusion heads, you'd have to have the head drilled and tapped to accept a bolt to hold that tensioner. So I'm just running the Fusion water pump setup to avoid that unnecessary hassle. I also forgot to mention that before I installed the valve covers, I installed new oil control valves. The prior set looked okay, but it's a lot easier to do it at that stage with the valve covers off than to decide you need to do it later after you've got the engine in and your intake assembly bolted on. And I replaced all 4 oxygen sensors because all of that stuff can easily be done with the engine out, and those things are relatively inexpensive compared to the labor involved. So now I'm going to raise the engine up and maneuver it into the engine bay and start bolting it down and connecting everything that I disconnected in the process of removal. And I'll do another update midway through that process. Alright, I got the engine in. It was a little bit tricky lining up the exhaust manifold flanges with the collectors on the exhaust pipes. You have to keep an eye on that while you're guiding the engine in, slowly moving it in and down. It'll require multiple trips under the car to guide the pipes. A little pry bar helps because you've got studs in the manifolds that have to line up with the collector holes on the exhaust pipes as you're lowering the engine into place. But I got it bolted in, engine mount and transmission mount bolted up top. Exhaust collectors bolted to the manifolds. I connected most of the wiring up top that I can connect at this point. I connected the coolant lines that I could connect at this point. There's just a short little vacuum harness that connects to the engine, and I got it connected. I installed the throttle body and the intake, and I installed the EGR valve into the intake. At this point, I'm ready to install the radiator support assembly, and I'll plug in the fans and the impact sensors and connect the wiring harness. This front wiring harness actually connects to the upper radiator support, and then I'll connect the main coolant lines and put the overflow bucket in place, connect the transmission cooler line, connect the refrigerant lines into the condenser that sits in front of the radiator, and at that point I'll add coolant and I'll add transmission fluid. Well, need to install the CV shafts before transmission fluid, or it's all going to run out on the floor through the CV port. After I get the core support installed and everything connected, I'll do another update. Alright, I got the radiator support and front bumper assembly installed, filled the engine and the radiator with coolant, connected all the lines, and got my wiring harness tucked up into the upper support and fastened, and then I crawled underneath and put the nut, the 3 nuts on the torque converter to bolt the torque converter to the flywheel. Next step is to install the CV shafts. I can't add transmission fluid until I've installed the CV shafts. So I'm going to install the CV shafts so I can add transmission fluid, and then I can start the car
make sure everything sounds okay and looks right, and if it does, then I'll install the headlights and the bumper cover and the hood, and I'll be done. So I'll do another update after I've installed the CV shafts. I got the CV shafts installed, and I filled up the transmission with transmission fluid. I installed the air box and the battery, and I'm ready to start it and see if it runs with the Fusion engine. Everything looks good, so I'm going to put the wheels on and put the headlights in, the front bumper cover and the hood on, and then I'll take it for a test drive. Alright, I just got back from the test drive. It went well, everything works like it should. I checked the fluids, everything looks good. In summary, the Duratec 3.0 in a Ford Fusion is a perfectly viable candidate for a swap into a Mazda 6 that has the 3.0 Duratec. Like and subscribe. Send me any questions if you're doing this swap or considering this swap. I'll do my best to get back to you. And thanks again.